women's historians are unhappy if there are not enough books about women, and they are unhappy if there are too many books about women. So this is really a serious challenge. So what you see is that there are lots of, there is a serious what you see is that there is a real interest for women's lives after 1989, and this is partly due to the fact that these biographies were missing from the shelves of the bookshops. On the other hand, in the past 5-10 years, you see another reason why these biographies had been written, and that is what I would call the women's her story turn, namely that these stories are actually presented in a very different framework. Because that's the main challenge for writing women's stories, that to which framework you are trying to understand and discuss women's lives. Is this a part of the traditional political history? Are you trying to use the same chronology and the same turning points? Or you are arguing that there is a very different turning point for women's lives? These are all professional, ethical, methodological, and also rhetorical choices. In the past 5-10 years, you see that there are several biographies which had been written about women's lives, and these stories are actually shifting the focus of women's achievements and women's participation into private life. So the women's lives are actually discussed through the traditional tropes, through women as mothers and widows and as supporters of important men. And on the one hand, you have to ask the question, where is it coming from? Especially in the post-communist context, when you have got like 50 years of forced emancipation, what is the origin of this particular shift? And you can also ask the question that what is the origin of this kind of shift, especially if you take into consideration that the past 25 years is basically about the adaptation of the European Union gender equality mechanisms and trying to give women rights and protecting women from certain discrimination. So against all odds, this kind of history actually emerged, and it's popular, it's read. So the question is, why is this happening? And that's what I was actually arguing in the talk, that history and women's history became a part of the mnemonic security for this new type of political regime, in a sense that it defines who are the reliable citizens, who are the desirable citizens, and women are actually acknowledged as citizens if they are supporting this particular political and cultural and economic order. So the liberal states are not coming from nowhere. They have got an ideological support, and this kind of ideological support has been there as a form of criticism to the neoliberal cultural, economic, and political order, which only define the individuals as the subjects of consumption, and the person's worth is basically can be measured by the amount of money that person has got on his or her bank account. And now we see this turn in values, and these values are actually connected to emotions like sacrifice, like love, like affect. And here, of course, again, women's stories are coming into the picture, because, you know, whose story is more desirable and easy to read than a sacrificing mother. So all these tropes and stereotypes which we thought that they were they belong to the past and they would be never emerging, they did emerge. And it, you know, there is a political urgency to ask the question why this is actually happening. And in the lecture, I was arguing that we have a great political and also strategic opportunity to think about what are the messages, what can we say about this particular trend, and also what can we do as far as the emergence of this anti-gender discourse, and also about how these illiberal states are actually using how the illiberal states are actually using history as a site of fighting for mnemonic security. I have to say I'm quite dizzy about these turns. There has been so many turns in history writing, and everybody was, very keen on following the recent turns. What I think would be important in the future, especially for those who are thinking now, trying to choose a good PhD research topic or a new topic for a new book, is to think about what kind of values they think this kind of work should radiate or transmit. Because on the one hand, you can say that these kind of women's stories, which are based on sacrifice or effect or whatever, they are not good histories. On the other hand, you cannot really say for these thousands of women who are happily reading this book that, what you are doing is not good. Right? So in a sense, you have to have a very responsible political and ethical position, that it's not a solution saying that these women are deplorables, like Hillary Clinton called all these women, while you are reading these popular books. We should think about those who are trying to construct narratives about women's lives, because that's what historians are doing, that we should do this in an accessible language about women who are really interesting, and try to think about this kind of questions with a very simple question in mind. Do we have anything to say with this particular life story? Do we have, a message which would talk and to a wider group of people? I think the inspirations, so what kind of stories we should be telling, should come from the stories of the 19th century, and also stories from women's resistance during communism, because both stories, the 19th century and also the stories coming from the resistance against communism, they give us certain toolkit, certain emotional vocabulary, and also teaches us certain survival strategies. So from the 19th century, when there was nothing and you believe that you will be actually trying to enrich and to achieve more and more, you might get the optimism that this is actually possible. So in the mid-19th century, women did not have the right to vote. They could not get to the universities. If somebody wanted to study, that was a kind of privilege and also a personal struggle. And from during the communism, what you can learn is that how actually the state can be a defunct state, in a sense not serving the needs and the support of what you can learn from the history of the communism is that how to fight against the state, which is an oppressive state, how to fight against double speech. So on the one hand, you have, the stories of emancipation, but we know in the reality that was a big struggle. So in a sense, when the future female women's historians are looking for topics to study, we have to be very political and strategic, and also utilize this important need for engaging stories, because from women's lives, from past stories, we can always learn personal struggles. We can always learn that there is not one real story, but there are different varieties of personal strategies. We can learn that there is not such a thing as normal life, because there is not one person who would carry the flag that I am the normal person. So we see the different negotiations between individuals, how to make a meaningful life. So we can learn lots of different strategies, positionalities towards institutions, if we are understanding how women actually lived their lives in the past. Private has been always has been always reconceptualized depending on the different power relations. And if you see how, for example, The Handmaid's Tale, this novel which was published in 1985, was only read by feminist comparative literature scholars, and now this is one of the most popular TV series, you see that there are always changing contexts for this kind of work. And I believe that the recent popularity of dystopian novels actually are sending a warning sign for all of us that there is a serious theorizing which needs to be done as far as what is private and what are the limits of intervention. Because if you read the, let's say, the novels of the, or if you are reading the autobiographies of Polish women who were sent to exile in Russia, in Tsarist Russia, you see a very different privacy than if you see the women who were imprisoned during communist times. And if you are reading the stories of women who are actually surveyed, their body parts are used for different types of operations, and you have a chip in your body, you see that the borders and bordering of the private had been always renegotiated. What you see now is that this intimacy and privacy is actually moving inside the body. And this kind of border, what you believe is a fixed border where your skin is, that is not necessarily a border anymore. And of course, you can say that's a brave new word. But on the other hand, and you can look around hopelessly what to do, but I would suggest to read the novels and the autobiographies and the letters of those women who actually in their times were facing very much the same novel approaches and the questions. So when somebody was experiencing the deportation to Tsarist Russia, you know, for her that was as dramatic and as new as it is for us today to think about having chips in our bodies. So I don't want to argue that everything stays the same, no matter how much change is happening, but I'm arguing that we are not defenseless as far as these changes are concerned, because we can take inspiration from the past stories. In the Hannes Zigrist talk, Joanne Scott was basically arguing that the major mistake what women's historians committed in the past decades using the category of gender is related to the fact that they were not thinking about politics, they were not political enough. And I think that's a very legitimate criticism, in a sense that on the one hand, women's history got institutionalized, so there were women's archives, and women got jobs in different higher educational institutions. So you have a certain normalization, professionalization. There are several professional associations which had been founded. On the other hand, this kind of professionalization happened independently from a kind of discussion with where real politics is actually happening. So when she's actually arguing to gender politics, I think that's an important point and an important message, because what you see now, how gender became a battlefield, how gender became a symbolic glue for different aspirations and political actors working together. You see that the only way how the progressive, secular, human rights-based activists can counteract is really starting to do politics, which means going out to do some groundwork and to do a kind of work which is populist in the best sense, which means accessible, which is read by the others, and which has got a certain impact on those who are actually reading this work. if you are reading the plans which are actually coming out from the federal institution supervising the American higher education, you see that you have got all the right to be scared as far as the future of public education is concerned, because on the one hand, there is an attack against using state money on humanities and on, supporting people to think and think critically. On the other hand, you have got this immense need for having people who can actually talk meaningfully about this major transformation and paradigm change what we are actually experiencing. So there's a mismatch here. So on the one hand, the state is withdrawing support from higher education and especially from humanities, labeling it as unnecessary because the necessary skills are all related to computer and whatever. On the other hand, what makes you human is that you are understanding and you are thinking critically about your existence and your goals in the world. And this kind of mismatch, I think, is a great opportunity for those who actually think critically about gender and politics and history, because you can actually come up with interesting ideas, and people are actually listening and reading your work. I can only bring in my example. So if you look at the publication strategy I have got, these publications in peer-reviewed articles because I have to fulfill the criteria of evaluation of my very kind of excellence-oriented research university. On the other hand, I'm also publishing in online journals, and I'm writing lots of open eds, which I could not have done if I hadn't had done all this serious thinking and peer-reviewed publications. So in this context, my research and my teaching actually informs my public presence. And this is all based on the privilege that I'm a tenured professor. So of course, this is also a responsibility for those who are in a teaching and research position. And we also have to know that this might not last forever, not only taking into consideration the specific challenges my university, Central European University, is facing, but also taking into consideration where I started, namely the redefinition, what is the role of higher education, what kind of questions the people who are actually paying our salary are expecting us to do. And also there is another challenge which hasn't been mentioned, namely that this illiberal state, which we are calling with Veronika Grzebelska the polypore state, this kind of state is actually creating its alternative higher educational institution. So if you look at the Hungarian context, the Hungarian National Bank set up a fund which has got the same budget as the whole Hungarian higher education. And they are financing building up a new higher educational system outside the Hungarian accreditation framework. It means that there is no quality control. The science they are doing there, it really depends on personal relationships, and they are actually serving and supporting the government and government ideology. And they are supporting the strong state, the liberal state. And it's very selective because you don't really need to have any kind of public achievements. You don't need to have any kind of academic achievements. What you have to have is the loyalty to the government and to the ideology of this government. So it means that it's one step back from the neoliberal academia where everything is quantified and you have got indexes and impact factors and whatever. But now what you have now is informality. So it is basically going back what science was in the Middle Ages. So it's a kind of small circle of selected, mostly men, who are actually working on selected subjects, and there are no institutions which would actually make any kind of quality control, like the science which was made in one monastery not necessarily was accepted by the other one. So when we are talking about what are the challenges, you have one challenge which is imposed by the neoliberal academia, which is saying, you have to count, and there is impact factor, and and this kind of economic neoliberal thinking of the budgetary constraints. But there is another challenge, which is basically destroying the basis of science, what we know from the Enlightenment. And this kind of illiberal state is building up this kind of institutions, not only in Hungary. You see that the AfD in Germany started a series of universities which is outside the German academic system, but they are bringing in youngsters and they have appointing professors. So you see that there are this double society is being built up. So that's what we call the polypore state, which is actually mirroring. It's creating another level of institutions built on the already existing institutions. And that is extremely dangerous. And I think here we have those who are, committed to progressive ideas and values basically expose that this kind of science is a pseudoscience. And this kind of science is outside the framework what we consider as science.